Good evening, sir.
Hello, good evening, Professor Sanjeev.
Yes, sir. Good evening, all.
Good
Sir,
evening,
we shall
everybody.
begin in 10-15 minutes. We are expecting the speaker to join us. And in the meanwhile, I think just have Zoya.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. फैजल देव जी ज्वाइन करेंगे तो बताना एंट्री मारेंगे अब ठीक है रहने तो अभी मत हो गया Welcome, Professor Faisal Devji, Zakir Husain
Hello,
College.
hello. Nice to see you.
Great, sir. Welcome to the college.
Thank
We
you
shall be
very much.
we shall be starting this event in a couple of minutes. We hope few more people will join, maybe in 2-3
Of
minutes.
course. It took me a bit of time to log on because I don't normally use Google. We normally use, for such events, it's normally Zoom or Teams. So I just had to go through a round of validations through Google, but that was fine.
Okay, no, actually we do work on Zoom as well, but it's more convenient for the students here to work on the Google Meet. So we thought it. Otherwise, the event is live on Facebook and it's also there on YouTube. So it will be
Okay.
live. So
Great.
people can access through both this. We have with us our principal, Dr. Masroor Ahmed Beg, and we have Dr. Ratnam Vattal from internal IQAC. She is the convener of them.
Yes.
Welcome them also.
Wonderful. Very
Welcome,
nice.
Professor Devji, and good evening, Professor Beg.
Very nice
Good evening.
to meet you.
Good evening, everybody. To be seen on the screen. Good morning, Faisal Devji.
Morning. Yes, it's 5:30 for you, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
5:30. Are you abroad right now?
I'm in Oxford, yes.
Okay, right now you're in Oxford. So must be, what is the time over there?
About noon.
That's afternoon.
Yeah, noon. It's 5.5 hours difference.
Okay. Here in India, we are having 5:31 now.
Yes.
So how is the
weather
corona? How is the situation of corona over there? Corona.
Not very good. We have moved into our second lockdown. So
Okay.
today is the first day of the lockdown for a month-long lockdown.
Okay.
And it's not so nice because the first lockdown was over the summer, so at least the weather was nice.
Okay.
But it's now the winter, so it gets dark very early. But I
Okay.
understand the weather in Delhi is beautiful. I was just speaking to a friend of mine yesterday.
Right.
So I guess we can begin now, and may I now ask Zoya to formally begin the proceeding. Zoya, it's up to you now.
Yes. So am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
We welcome you all to the second lecture of the Gandhi Lecture Series. We would like to thank the Internal Quality Assurance Cell for collaborating with us in this event. Today, we have Honorable Faisal Devji Sir to enlighten us on the topic Gandhi's silence. We would also like to thank Principal Sir for joining and becoming a part of this event. I now invite Principal Sir to say a few words.
Good evening, Professor Faisal Devji, Dr. Ratnam Vattal, Dr. Sanjeev, and other colleagues to be seen on the screen for joining this evening session and talking about the Gandhiji silence. I feel honored that a professor from University of Oxford has joined us to share his thought on Gandhiji's. You know that, of course, I think that Faisal ji must be an Indian by origin. Indian by origin. So welcome to your own homeland, Delhi or around Delhi. And this is the distinguished Gandhi Lecture Series, which is being delivered by such a profound scholar on Gandhi from Oxford, London. Professor Faisal Devji is Professor of Modern South Asian History and is also Director of the Asian Studies Center, University of Oxford. We are all geared up to talk about the role of Gandhiji in India's freedom and in making of India and making of India's culture. It is just not limited to the freedom that we have attained in the year 1947. In fact, we must go much beyond that. Reason being, still we remember Gandhiji, we still want to be Gandhian, we want to follow the paths shown by Gandhiji of love, affection, tolerance, and self-reliance and non-violence. So Gandhiji has been icon in our heart, and by nature, by default, we all are Gandhians. The only thing is that some situation make us slightly different from being Gandhian. In our general life, or speaking in common parlance, Indians are Gandhian, and but his respect was a thought or being much more popular in abroad, in many countries of the world. National Quality and Assurance Cell has been kind enough to collaborate with the Gandhi Studies Circle in Zakir Husain College for organizing such numerous programs. The topic is the Gandhiji's silence. Now the question is this, that though we are eager to hear Faisal Devji, because he must have a very good idea about that why Gandhiji, what he is going to speak on Gandhiji's silence. But we all say that Gandhiji is sending us messages daily, every day, though he is silent, but his thoughts are never silent. Because he lives in our heart. He lives in our heart. We have been constantly and regularly organizing seminar, webinars in his name. And we were organizing many pictorial kind of exhibition on Gandhi when we did not have the corona type of a crisis. So, but certainly as and when this pandemic situation will be over, we would expect that Professor Faisal Devji will be with us here in India at some point of time, and we will have a physical meeting and we'll be interacting with him. But certainly this is the moment when we can make use of it, that we can interact with him, that how we have to follow the path of Gandhiji. So Gandhiji is not silent. In fact, we are silent about Gandhiji. As and when we get an opportunity to propagate his idea, to propagate the thoughts that he has, then we can keep Gandhiji more and more alive in the years to come. And it becomes the earnest duty of the faculty members, those who study, those who teaching profession, that must pass on this message to our students of today as well as future. So not being much in between with Professor Faisal, even I'm very eager to listen to him. So I've cancelled all my assignment in this evening, which were fixed up. Generally, I'm popular for exiting or in a way being a passive listener. But here in this case, I want to continuously remain with Professor Faisal ji. So once again, I would like to welcome Professor Faisal on behalf of the Zakir Husain fraternity and wish you a great success in your life. And we all faculty members, students are really eager to know. Thank you very much, Zoya, for giving this opportunity to welcome and say a few words about Professor Faisal ji and about the seminar. Thank you very much. Over to Zoya.
Thank you, sir. I now invite Sanjeev sir to give an introduction of our distinguished speaker for today.
Professor Masroor Ahmed Beg, principal of our college, Zakir Husain Delhi College. Professor Faisal Devji, Dr. Ratnam Wattal, distinguished guests, colleagues, and dear students. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all the second edition of the Distinguished Lecture Series organized by Gandhi Study Circle in collaboration with the Internal Quality assurance cell of our college. Let me remind the audience that it's the second of our series of lecture. The first was delivered by Professor Akil Bilgrami, and we are fortunate to have Professor Devji with us today. Uh, 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 Gandhi epitomizes the refinement and perfection that a person can attain. His vision of truth and nonviolence, enduring commitment to social justice, normative economics, religious pluralism, and relentless striving for harmony between nature and human being have become extremely important in the context of today. It is important to revisit some of the aforementioned ideas to understand him and his words in his worldview in the context of multiple challenges that confront us today. With this objective to deliberate upon Gandhi's legacy of inclusiveness that underlines Gandhi's philosophy, the second lecture of the series we have today amongst us Professor Faisal Devji. It is a special privilege to introduce this brilliant, versatile scholar of international repute. Currently, Faisal Devji, as Principal Sir has already spoken, is a professor of Indian history and director of the Asian Studies Center at the University of Oxford. He received his PhD in intellectual history from the University of Chicago uh, and taught at Yale University and the New School of Social Research in New York before joining Oxford. He was junior fellow at the Society of Fellows, Harvard University, a Jobs Altemer Chair at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and is an Institute of Public Knowledge Scholar at New York University. Professor Faisal Devji's versatilities show in the range of works that he not only produced, but the kind of provocations that he has made across many disciplines and areas. His writings and incursions on the theme of Islam, globalization, violence, and ethics have produced new perspective on this and have contributed significantly to our intellectual debates. His important work in the areas include a vast number of essays and books, such as Landscapes of the Jihad, Militancy, Morality, Modernity, Terrorist in Search of Humanity, Militant Islam and Global Politics, Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea, and the much acclaimed The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence. I must confess I had little acquaintance of his genius till I read his scholarly work, The Impossible Indian. In that path-breaking work, written in 2012, Professor Devji offers a provocative new genealogy of Gandhian thought and demonstrate that Gandhi is dealing with violence, uh, guided by his ethical duty, were far more radical than those of contemporary revolutionaries. Today, Professor Devji has chosen to speak on Gandhi's silence, another very intriguing idea. We know from Gandhi's life that he observed weekly day of silence on every Monday. Uh, Silence or mourn for Gandhi connotates what special preoccupation? Was it a practice of religious abstinence or negative cessation of speech and action, or had a deeper connotation? To quote Gandhi himself, where he writes in Harijan in 1938, silence has now become both a physical and spiritual necessity for me. Originally, it was taken to relieve the sense of pressure, and then I wanted time for writing. After, however, I had practiced it for some time, I saw the spiritual value of it. It suddenly flashed across my mind that was a time when I could best hold communion with God. And now I feel as though I was naturally built for silence. Professor Devji locates the secret of silence as representing the idea of ethical self-control and critique of voice and communication. To dwell more upon the idea, may I now call upon Professor Faisal Devji to share his critical insights and thoughts on the subject. Welcome, Professor Devji.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to have been invited to speak at this event. And I want to thank in particular the principal, Professor Ahmed, Professor Vatal, and you, Professor Kumar, along with Zoya Ansari for introducing me. So let me proceed directly to my lecture, and then I hope we can discuss it afterwards. Now, democracy is generally linked with voice, speech, and communication, just as tyranny is defined by silence and obedience. Yet, silence also lies at the heart of freedom, represented in democratic practice by the secret ballot. As an institutional form, the secret ballot is meant to guarantee the voter's anonymity as well as liberty from the undue influence of external forces. But it possesses another dimension as well, one which has to do with the coincidental character of the democratic majority. If such majorities are to reflect anything more than the identity, organization, and prejudice of the largest or most powerful social groups, they must be composed of voters who have arrived at their decisions independently and so in silence. Democratic majorities are constituted by a logic of coincidence, with the general will understood as a statistical average rather than a social identity. Its legitimacy depends upon this will representing the decisions of a range of social identities brought together for a number of sometimes incommensurable reasons. However far the working of elections falls from this logic, it remains the only justification for democracy as a political form. But this means the voice, speech, and communication that makes democracy possible can also endanger it by unduly influencing voters. Their decisions are then deprived of autonomy and integrity far more insidiously than through bribery or threats, with the elimination or ritualization of silence destroying the individual's very capacity for freedom. At issue is the character of political debate as a kind of rehearsed conversation, one in which social identities and passions are mobilized to prevent the formation of a statistical average by way of silent, solitary, and even ignorant decisions. While under ideal conditions, such interests are meant to cancel each other out precisely in order to produce such an average, their institutionalization in political parties accomplishes the opposite. It is not social identities that are themselves problematic, but rather the party structure that appropriates them to create collective passions. For the political party produces pre-digested arguments and talking points in which individual reasoning is not only set aside for its voters, but actively forbidden among their representatives as well. Now, how might the individual freedom upon which democracy depends be protected from its collective form? In an essay of 1943 entitled On the Abolition of All Political Parties, the philosopher Simone Weil took Jean-Jacques Rousseau at his word in arguing that parties undercut the basis of democracy by eliminating the silence within which individual freedom is alone possible. Quite apart from giving voice to collective passions that replace the general will by a social majority, the party's polemical structure entails its unconcern with the truth, justice, or goodness that the individual conscience is meant to deliberate in the public interest. Its constant competition against rivals means that the party turns all such ends into means to augment its own power in a desire for growth that knows no limits because it acknowledges no other end. Weil claimed that under these conditions, even the truth offered by political ideology is subordinated to the party's desire for limitless expansion and becomes incidental to it. Truth, justice, and goodness are thus removed from political decisions even as ideals. This puts all those involved with them into various degrees of mendacity and bad faith. Her solution was to abolish political parties, which she saw as obstacles to freedom whose extreme manifestations were to be found in the party structures of communism and fascism. Instead, Weil recommended that loosely organized intellectual circles should be formed around journals to provide venues for political debate in a way that reinstated the individual and so public interest at the basis of political life. While she does not seem to have realized the party's role in protecting its members from the organized violence of their opponents, Weil might well have judged this function in a Gandhian way, by noting how it replicates in itself the very enemy it is founded to fight and thus perpetuates its evil. Now, remarkably like him in her focus on non-violence, manual labor, fasting, and truth as a form of divine grace incalculable in its distance from all instrumentality, was also preceded by Gandhi as a critic of democratic institutions. In his manifesto of 1909 entitled Hind Swaraj or Indian Home Rule, Gandhi inveighed against parliamentary democracy, famously describing the so-called mother of parliaments in Westminster as a sterile woman and a prostitute. With these patriarchal metaphors, Gandhi sought to describe the way in which parliament operated only with the spur of outside pressure, indifferent as to whether this took the form of popular demands or the blandishments of a wealthy few. At the same time, it was placed under the control of changing masters in the shape of the prime minister and his cabinet, who bought loyalty by the inducements of wealth, honors, and influence. Forced to abide by party discipline, its members were enthralled to these changing leaders who were themselves concerned solely with the expansion of their power. In such a system, whose stability relied upon the ritualization of conflict along party lines, neither truth, justice, goodness, nor indeed the public interest was served except by accident. As for the voters' freedom of conscience and judgment, whose deliberations were necessarily silent, it was drowned out by a purely partisan political debate in Parliament and the press. I quote, "To the English voters, their newspaper is their Bible. They take their cue from their newspapers, which are often dishonest. The same fact is differently interpreted by different newspapers according to the party in whose interests they are edited. One newspaper would consider a great Englishman to be a paragon of honesty, another would consider him dishonest. What must be the condition of the people whose newspapers are of this type?" Close quote. The competition set up by parliamentary democracy produced stability at the expense of truth and so freedom, which could only lose meaning without the former. Now, instead of seeing the alternation of governments in a democracy as demonstrated the political freedom it promised, Gandhi understood it as an example of inconstancy that was itself mechanical. Quote, "These people change their views frequently. It is said that they change them every 7 years. These views swing like the pendulum of a clock and are never steadfast. The people would follow a powerful orator or a man who gives them parties, receptions, etc. As are the people, so is their parliament." Close quote. Rather than blaming the English for this state of affairs, Gandhi attributed it to the link between parliamentary democracy and industrial capitalism, or what he called modern civilization, whose, quote, "true test lies in the fact that people living in it make bodily welfare the object of life," close quote. But modern civilization failed to satisfy bodily wants, and not only because it was made possible for a few at the expense of the many. Also important was the fact that its desire was insatiable and led to a limitless expansion no different from that which Whale argued marked the thirst for power in party politics. Indeed, the two were linked in the growth of capital, industry, and empire. Gandhi described this desire in the language of addiction and saw it resulting in the destruction of the subject whose freedom democracy was meant to seek. Quote, "It is eating into the vitals of the English nation. It must be shunned. Parliaments are really emblems of slavery. If you will sufficiently think over this, you will entertain the same opinion and cease to blame the English. They rather deserve our sympathy." Close quote. Now, Gandhi was a harsh critic of mediation, as we have seen from his views of parliamentary democracy as a structure of political representation. And he thought voice and speech were forms of mediation in their own right. In Hind Swaraj, for example, Gandhi inveighed against doctors and lawyers as, in effect, agents of the colonial state, itself representing the ultimate form of mediation as a neutral third party there to arbitrate between Indians rendered into partisan interests. He described doctors as purveyors of commodities from the pharmaceuticals industry meant to alienate patients from their own bodies in another instance of addiction. Lawyers, for their part, existed not to resolve conflicts, but increase the state's power by imposing a peace that needed constant enforcement between the rival interests it relied upon and therefore had to maintain. Such forms of mediation, of course, represented both the manner in which the colonial state operated as well as its justification, with Gandhi advocating their circumvention in unmediated relations between Indians who should no longer be defined as antagonistic interests. Language played a role in all the instances of mediation I have described, especially the highly technical kind used for legal and medical communication. But it became crucial in certain types of conflict, of which the mounting controversies over proselytism in the 1920s took pride of place, especially among Hindus and Muslims in North India, but also including Christian missionary activity directed against both groups throughout the country. Rather than seeing these disputes as the problematic inheritance of pre-modern identities, we should understand them as the utterly modern products of liberal politics, which had turned religious communities into interests and therefore constituencies. Proselytism, in other words, became controversial for the first time in this manner because it was thought to be an attempt at augmenting the electoral or political power of one group over another, in much the same way as parties operated to diminish the real or potential majority of their rivals. Addressing the violence that accompanied accusations from Hindus, Muslims, and Christians of predatory missionizing by their religious rivals, Gandhi suggested stopping not conversion itself, but its mediation in language. To be true to the ideals of their own faiths, he argued missionaries should serve as their best representatives in refusing to lie about, unfairly criticize, or run down the religions of others. In doing so, they would also serve humanity by conducting their charitable works in silence and thus drawing converts by the sheer force of their example rather than through unseemly and invariably untruthful polemics. In a 1931 speech to Christian missionaries in London, for example, he said that, quote, "The idea of converting people to one's faith by speech and writings, by appeal to reason and emotion, and by suggesting that the faith of his forefathers is a bad faith, in my opinion, limits the possibilities of serving humanity. Religion is like a rose. It throws out the scent which attracts like a magnet, and we are drawn to it involuntarily." Close quote. Speech, and indeed language itself, in other words, betrayed religious like all other truth by mediating it in argument and collective passion. And while Gandhi was concerned here with missionaries in particular, his criticism held true of persuasion as an important part of political practice more generally. As a fundamental liberal virtue, this kind of argumentation had already come under attack from both the left and the right as a disingenuous form of bourgeois discussion, one incapable of advancing any real change. Gandhi, however, reimagined persuasion in sacrificial terms by offering up the sight and sometimes even spectacle of speechless acts as the most effective demonstration of their truth. In order to manifest itself, therefore, political as much as moral or religious truth had to disavow voice for action and sound for sight. While privileging the visible over the audible as a modality for truth, Gandhi also lent it olfactory form as a fragrance which drew the potential convert to itself involuntarily. In other words, he conceived of neither the visible nor the audible as pure forms, since one could include the sense of smell and another the written word as an amalgam of sight and sound. It was the interpretive and so mediating function of language itself that he distrusted, one for which silence served as an antonym. Now, the unmediated visibility that Gandhi prized as a modality of truth was nothing more than a making visible of silence in persuasion. It was a metamorphosis of, or conversion, to use religious terms, in which silence lost its autonomy and was mediated by sight as a negative form. And while this logic seems to countermand Gandhi's emphasis on unmediated relations, it does conform to his propensity for negative forms more generally, of which non-violence, non-possession, and non-cooperation are the most famous. Unlike the kind of mediation that characterized the colonial state, which produced rival interests as positive forms requiring arbitration, silence, mediated by sight, renounced all positivity and could only be known by its absence as something that was both inaudible and invisible. Silence allowed for unmediated relations because of its doubly negated form. Unlike the ability to speak or reason, which constituted one of the classical definitions of the human species, silence did not depend on the logic either of shared capacities or the biological similarities that, in Gandhi's view, served only to fragment humanity into various kinds of hierarchies. Indeed, the imperative to unify the human race through language and reason not only ended by dehumanizing those among its members who were seen as being unreasonable and beyond persuasion, it also drew an absolute separation between one species and another. It was silence, or the inability to communicate through language then, which made moral relations between humans and animals possible. The context for Gandhi's reflections on interspecies relations are provided in his time by the violent controversies between Hindus and Muslims over cow slaughter. Grappling with these conflicts, Gandhi sought to expand and reinterpret the Hindu injunction to protect cattle not only to human but all animal life. He saw in cow protection humanity's effort to go beyond itself, and in a 1921 article in his journal Young India, emphasized the unilateral and voiceless character of this demand. Quote, "The appeal of the lower order of creation is all the more forcible because it is speechless," unquote. Without either identifying animal with human life or requiring the kind of contractual reciprocity in their relations that was strangely expected among human beings, Gandhi based them on the very absence of similarity and similitude. As with his views on conversion, which we have seen turn out to be about the problem of liberal persuasion more generally, Gandhi's understanding of cow protection was also about the liberal values of reciprocity and contract. In his view, of course, such values were made possible by the colonial state as a neutral third party, there to mediate between its subjects construed as political interests. But as we have seen, Gandhi thought these relations to be unworkable and deeply violent in the hierarchies they set up. He was fascinated by what moral and so political relations might look like if they were not founded in what he thought was the transient and unequal agreement of a contract. The controversies of a cow slaughter allowed Gandhi to imagine relationships unmediated by language in another way. In an article of 1924 in Young India, he came close to attributing language to the cow. Quote, "The cow is the purest type of subhuman life. She pleads before us on behalf of the whole of the subhuman species for justice to it at the hands of man, the first among all that lives. She seems to speak to us through her eyes. You are not appointed over us to kill us and eat our flesh or otherwise ill-treat us, but to be our friend and guardian." Close quote. Yet crucial here is the fact that this appeal is not only voiceless, but unknowable, and thus calls for the unilateral interpretation and moral judgment of human beings. Inevitable in the relations between species, Gandhi thought that relations among human beings too should be marked by an acknowledgement of their fundamental incommunicability and therefore silence. As we have seen when discussing its negative mediation by visibility, for Gandhi, silence is by no means linked to secrecy or the concealment of inner life. On the contrary, it makes for unmediated relations marked by absolute transparency. It is voice, in other words, that creates the impression, if not illusion, of secrecy and so hypocrisy by inevitably concealing the very truth it seeks to express. While Simone Weil was concerned with protecting the inner life from collective passions and rehearsed speech then, Gandhi seemed at first glance to want to expose this fundamentally silent life by rescuing it from the mediation of voice. But a closer look reveals that his attitude towards the inner life was nominalist or premised upon its radical ignorance of an invariably external and therefore divine truth. Gandhi was concerned not only by the kind of noise that overwhelmed the moral as well as political subject from the outside, but equally with protecting the inner life from the random or uncontrolled thoughts and fantasies that threaten to undo it from within. As he writes in his autobiography of 1930, quote, "My hesitancy in speech, which was once an annoyance, is now a pleasure. Its greatest benefit has been that it has taught me the economy of words. I have naturally formed the habit of restraining my thoughts, and I can now give myself the certificate that a thoughtless word hardly ever escapes my tongue or pen, close quote. And this also meant defending the subject's outer world from its inner conflicts. Gandhi's weekly days of silence represented this dual form of preservation, both of the subject and against it, which he describes frequently in passages such as this, quote, "Experience has taught me that silence is part of the spiritual discipline of a votary of truth. Proneness to exaggerate, to suppress or modify the truth, wittingly or unwittingly, is a natural weakness of man, and silence is necessary in order to surmount it." Close quote. In effect, the inner life and its outer world were inextricably connected to one another, with neither able to claim autonomy for itself. The subject's freedom, therefore, had to be continuously disciplined so as not to become self-possessed, while at the same time being protected from the noise of external mediation. Silence functioned, in other words, as a double-edged sword, one that made the truth visible outside and even against the subject as much as for it. But what kind of selfhood did this entail, and how might we understand the freedom of its inner life? Perhaps we can find out by looking at Gandhi's autobiography. Reading through the book, one is struck by how anti-psychological it is. Gandhi does not appear to be very interested in motives or intentions, whether his own or those of others. And in some sense, his narrative can be read as the account of a purely external and even accidental causality. The confessional element in the text has deluded readers into mistaking it for a narrative of Gandhi's inner life rather than an act of ritual exposure. As part of his attempt to de-individualize the moral actor, Gandhi not only rejected an inner life for himself by refusing all privacy, he also sought to destroy the ego so as to have it replaced by the truth that for him was entirely external, objective, and so divine. While some of this truth might be known, other parts of it could neither be concealed nor communicated. Quote, "There are some things which are known only to oneself and one's maker. These are clearly incommunicable. The experiments I am about to relate are not such." Close quote. The ignorance, or rather incommunicability, and therefore silence at the heart of the autobiography turns many of Gandhi's biographical anecdotes into fortuitous ones. His escape from various moral dangers attributed to causes whose very externality makes them providential rather than intentional. Here, for instance, is his commentary on an awkward experience with a prostitute as a young man. Quote, "I sat near the woman on her bed, but I was tongue-tied. She naturally lost patience with me and showed me the door with abuses and insults. I then felt as though my manhood had been injured and wished to sink to the ground for shame. But I have ever since given thanks to God for having saved me. I can recall 4 more similar incidents in my life, and in most of them, my good fortune, rather than any effort on my part, saved me." Close quote. If Gandhi is so intent on the externality of truth, it is because he understands that we cannot be fully cognizant of all the factors that go into the making of any act. Sexual knowledge, for instance, he attributes to the incommunicable memory of a previous life, saying of his first experience of it that, quote, "The impressions of the former birth are potent enough to make all coaching superfluous," close quote. He also rejects knowledge and so its voicing and communication as a criterion of moral action on egalitarian grounds. For this would turn the wealthy, powerful, and educated into the most moral of agents, because of course they are the only ones who have the capacity to speak and to be heard in certain ways. The autobiography is replete with instances of the unknowable in statements like, quote, "We can also see that judging a man from his outward act is no more than a doubtful inference, inasmuch as it is not based on sufficient data," close quote. Because a man's inner life was not apprehensible to the outside observer, he had to be dealt with on the basis of what we might call radical ignorance. Gandhi is ignorant of his own wife's inner life, saying that, quote, "Kasturba herself does not perhaps know whether she has any ideals independently of mine. It is likely that many of my doings have not her approval, even today. We never discuss them. I see no good in discussing them. Close quote. And he also expresses ignorance of his own motives. For example, when reflecting upon his advice urging mill workers on strike in Ahmedabad in 1918 to honor the pledge that they had given him. Quote, the mill hands had taken the pledge at my suggestion. They had repeated it before me day after day, and the very idea that they might now go back upon it was to me inconceivable. Was it pride, or was it my love for the laborers and my passionate regard for truth that was at the back of this feeling? Who can say? Close quote. Given the radical ignorance at the heart of all human endeavors, how might it be possible to act morally without depending upon voice, speech, and so knowledge? By committing oneself to a principle almost as a kind of wager and out of ignorance, something that for Gandhi took the shape of a vow. In his student days in London, the future Mahatma had been saved from drink and women by the vow he had made his mother, though it had not been based on any knowledge or proof about the virtue of abstinence. And in South Africa, Gandhi had justified wearing a charm put around his neck by his mother for no other reason than another such vow, which he describes in a conversation with a Quaker friend who was urging him to discard it. Quote, he saw around my neck the Vaishnava necklace of Tulsi beads. He thought it to be superstition and was pained by it. This superstition does not become you. Come, let me break the necklace. No, you will not. It is a sacred gift from my mother. But do you believe in it? I do not know its mysterious significance. I do not think I should come to harm if I did not wear it. But I cannot, without sufficient reason, give up a necklace that she put around my neck out of love and in the conviction that it would be conducive to my welfare. When, with the passage of time, it wears away and breaks of its own accord, I shall have no desire to get a new one. But this necklace cannot be broken. Close quote. The vow then was in some sense arbitrary, but saved from self-indulgence by its permanent and sacrificial character. It compelled moral action by a decision that might well produce its proof in subsequent experience, but was initially baseless. Quote, the importance of vows grew upon me more clearly than ever before. I realized that a vow, far from closing the door to real freedom, opened it. Up to this time, I had not met with success because the will had been lacking, because I had had no faith in myself, no faith in the grace of God, and therefore my mind had been tossed on the boisterous sea of doubt. I believe in effort. I do not want to bind myself with vows, is the mentality of weakness and betrays a subtle desire for the thing to be avoided. Or where can be the difficulty in making a final decision? Close quote. The subtle desire Gandhi refers to in the quotation above shows that he was not unaware of the complex motivations of inner life, but the point was to allay these by a resort to the world outside. Having turned himself into a moral agent by the purely external means of a vow, and in the absence either of knowledge or its communication, Gandhi was bound to deal with other moral actors in the same way. And he did so by ignoring their inner lives and taking them at their word, or rather testing them by it, and so forcing moral life to the surface in a kind of nominalism not unfamiliar to the lawyer in the Mahatma. Rather than revealing anything about the subject, then language was to be used against it as a kind of external force, shaping or keeping it true to itself. It was deployed like a legal testimony in some sense, but decidedly not so as to expose the subject's inner life and motivation. The familiar Gandhian aphorism, my life is my message, may not actually have been uttered by him, but remains nevertheless true to the Mahatma's thought, since the message in question is conceived not as a verbal or written communication, so much as the evidence provided by life itself. The message, in other words, has been deprived of its linguistic form and subordinated to or tested against the silent visibility of a life that Gandhi's autobiography is meant to do little more than expose to scrutiny or judgment. Such an emptying out of the subject bewildered Gandhi's enemies, whose chief accusation against him has always been hypocrisy, with Churchill famously calling the Mahatma the world's most successful humbug. These enemies have, from Gandhi's own days to the present, been driven by an urge to find the inner motive or secret that informed his actions, refusing to lend his words or acts any credence in their own right. But because he took words at face value, however, the Mahatmas, for his part, only asked his interlocutors to be true to them. This resulted in a competition where the one truest to himself might convert the rest by his integrity without requiring any prior agreement as to aims and ideals, something we have already seen in Gandhi's views of proselytization. This made moral action into a kind of wager, even if Gandhi thought that the true follower of nonviolence would always win. Yet it was not simply the inability to know as a kind of failure that defined Gandhi's morals, which would give them an entirely passive character. Instead, he saw the truth as being external in nature and therefore divine, because it could never be fully known. And the individual's task was to find this truth at the cost of his inner life, because it constituted his only reality and at the same time tied him to a world beyond himself. Quote, I think it is wrong to expect certainties in this world. Where else but God, that is truth, I think it is wrong to expect certainties in this world where all else but God, that is truth, is an uncertainty. All that appears and happens about and around us is uncertain, transient. But there is a supreme being hidden therein as a certainty, and one would be blessed if one could catch a glimpse of that certainty and hitch one's wagon to it. Close quote. The inner life and the moral self, in other words, cannot fully recognize the foreign reality of which it is constituted. But rather than serving as an example of the self's failure, the externality of this truth is in fact the only connection that the individual possesses with his neighbors as much as with God. One way of putting this would be to say that the Mahatma understands the subject as being determined by factors outside itself, and it is these that link it with other subjects and make social life possible. The possession of one's truth, therefore, takes the form of a dispossession. Quote, the seeker after truth should be humbler than the dust. The world crushes the dust under its feet, but the seeker after truth should be so humble himself that even the dust could crush him. Only then, and not till then, will he have a glimpse of the truth. Close quote. Whatever inspiration this way of thinking might have drawn from ancient or medieval ideas of the religious life, far more crucial is the modern context in which Gandhi articulated it. Rather than some kind of uninterrupted tradition, the Mahatma's vision of moral selfhood was both produced by and deployed against the 19th century individualism that made autobiographies possible. In its Gujarati original, the title of Gandhi's book, rendered into English as The Story of My Experiments with Truth, reads something like Truth's Experiments, Satya na Prayogo, in which it is not the Mahatma who is the subject, but instead truth. Rejecting the spirituality that emerged as a reaction against what used to be called bourgeois individualism only to reinforce it, Gandhi's autobiography audaciously seeks to tell the story of truth's experiments with the self it both sustains and destroys. Now, what does all of this have to do with the link between silence and freedom with which I began this lecture? Let us recall that Simone Weil had traced the ruination of democracy to its abandonment of ideals like truth, justice, and goodness. It was the externality of such ideals to the rehearsed speech of party politics that was crucial in limiting the latter's reach. The individual's freedom, in other words, was premised upon these ideals, which alone made political judgment in the public interest possible. They could be instrumentally deployed by parties backed by ascribed social identities, of course, but nevertheless represented ends in their own right, rather than power as a means turned into an end in the form of limitless desire. Abolishing political parties was Wales' way of preventing such an eventuality. While not going so far as to recommend the abolition of political parties, despite his severe criticism of parliamentary democracy, Gandhi also sought to reinforce the individual's moral agency, and he did so through the prescription of silence over speech. But rather than protecting the subject from outside influence and so reifying the individual as a purely autonomous being, silence here worked as a form of internal discipline that protected the outside world as well. It was meant additionally to open the individual up to the externality of truth, which in Gandhi's view was another name for God. And this implied that human beings were not brought together by any shared quality like speech and reason, nor a biological one like race or reproduction, but only in their openness to quite alien and metaphysical figures such as truth, justice, and goodness. To be workable, therefore, democracy required the existence of a subject outside or beyond its own loquacious logic. What became of words and voice in this vision? They were reduced to pure artifice and deprived of any authenticity in the revelation of a subject's inner truth. This did not stop communication, just as Gandhi did not cease to read and write during his days of silence, but it did displace and discipline speech as the privileged revelation of inner life. Words and language served as external constraints to test, limit, and shore up this subject, whose truth Gandhi described in his autobiography as being founded on a presupposition. Quote, "I have not seen him, neither have I known him. I have made the world's faith in God my own, and as my faith is ineffaceable, I regard that faith as amounting to experience. However, as it may be said that to describe faith as experience is to tamper with truth, it may perhaps be more correct to say that I have no word for characterizing my belief in God." Close quote. It is not the knowledge or experience of God, it is not that the knowledge or experience of God is so ineffable as to be beyond words, but that it functions wordlessly by virtue of its absence or negative form as a presupposition. God here represents nothing but the silence that for Gandhi destroys the self while opening it up to the externality of its own truth, and on this basis, its relations with others as well. A revelation of emptiness rather than any concealment of being, silence made freedom possible in the very stop it put to the false and often violent mediations of speech, showing that social and even interspecies relations rested on a quite different foundation. And while his ideas may seem arcane, they are no more so than those of Rousseau's that Weil cites in her description of the general will. We have seen indeed that Gandhi applied them to the most concrete and quotidian problems, from conversion to cow slaughter. Incapable of guaranteeing the truth, Gandhi's experiments nevertheless made surprising revelations possible, and in doing so, allowed for the subject's moral transformation out of a sovereign decision lacking its own proof. We have seen this in his advocacy of the vow as a decision that produced a truth rather than being derived from one. This made truth, like justice and goodness, crucial to the subject's inner life, while yet refusing to validate them in the form of a doctrine meant for others. Like the missionaries urged to propagate their religion silently, Gandhi's moral subject was also meant to test the results of his endeavors against those of his rivals. Such a theater of competition represented perhaps the highest form of political debate, but one that could only be seen in everyday life rather than heard in Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now we will have a question and answer round. The rules for question and answer round are: you can either leave a question in the chat box or you can come live and ask the question. The question should be brief, relevant to the theme and to the point. Now I will hand over to Biprajit for the question and answer round.
A very good evening to everyone, and especially our guest of honor today, Professor Faisal Devji. Thank you so much, sir, for your words and for the insights that you have given us on the topic that we have all gathered here to discuss upon. Not taking much time, as Zoya already said, we are taking two forms of question. One question would be through the chat box. You can use the chat box to put in your questions as much as you want, and we'll try to accommodate almost every question if possible. One more important point is that we are allowing one question per person, given that we have too many participants and would like to accommodate as many participants as we can. And hence we'll not prefer cross-questioning or interrogation kind of questioning happening here, so that many more after you get a chance to put their questions forward to sir. Now, since I don't see any questions on the chat box right now, I'd invite anyone to ask a direct question to Professor Faisal Devji on any particular thing that they have any doubt with or want to comment on about everything that Sir has said till now about the topic that we have gathered here to discuss this evening. Anyone who'd like to ask a direct question, kindly say your name first and let me recognize you, and you can go ahead after that.
May I initiate
Yes,
the
ma'am.
question answer round?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for your interesting and rich talk. I have a question about the value of silence as a political tool and as a moral tool, and how much of this silence as a political and moral strategy can be also misinterpreted. And the context I have in mind is of present day India, where we see that, I'm not going to mince my words, but where we see that the Hindu majoritarian ruling party has been actually imposing silence, and especially of its critics, of the opponents. And can silence then be used as an effective political way to demonstrate opposition when already silence is being imposed? Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the question. Sir, your answer to that.
Thanks very much. Yes, of course, the kind of silence Gandhi writes about is not an imposed silence. It has to be a voluntary one. It has to be one that is chosen by the subject. And it's meant to be a silence that, as it were, communicates more loudly than speech. But that does so by pointing out the pitfalls of speech. That refuses the primacy of speech as a form of mediation and as an embodiment of truth and knowledge. For a number of reasons that I mentioned in my talk, including the fact that speech can be made into a form of violence in its own right, that the speech of some depends upon the silence of others. And this seems to be the kind of thing you are talking about, because the silence imposed on, in whatever political context in the world, the silence imposed upon one set of people is always compensated for by the speech of another set. All right, so it's never just silence that is being promoted. It's always linked to speech, and this is where I think Gandhi's criticism comes in, because this would serve as an example precisely of the problem with speech that he thinks is so important. That this speech, which suppresses the speech of others, cannot represent truth, goodness, or justice. But rather than opposing good speech to bad speech, true speech to false speech, what he's suggesting is that we might displace speech itself, or treat it with some degree of circumspection because of its inherent limitations, and rather make visible our protest, which is in a way the meaning of satyagraha, right? Silently, if possible, and doing so by actually demonstrating in one's own actions the virtue of truth and non-violence, etc., non-possession. And this forces upon the opponent the task of refuting and indeed of interpreting this silence. So in a way, it's almost like an invitation that cannot be refused. Whereas countering speech with more speech ends up often with no result. It's just one form of speech set against another. Now, of course, Gandhi is not saying that people should not talk at all. He talks a great deal and he writes a great deal. But one of the things I think is happening in the questioning of speech is, it's offered up as a kind of warning for our over-reliance on speech as a manifestation of freedom, especially in political life. Because speech always embodies or carries with it the possibility that the speaker is untruthful or hypocritical. So what it invites is a kind of some often very interesting intervention, which is all about distinguishing what is true and what is false. Whether the speech is authentic and true speech or whether it is concealing something else. If you cut out speech and you actually aim to remain true to yourself visually, if you move from the audible to the visible, for instance, which is what all satyagraha does, then you're actually trying to set aside that interpretive form of analysis, which is about parsing, is this genuine? Is this really meant? But for that to be viable, satyagraha has to be self-sacrificial. Right? So if you are willing to sacrifice or submit yourself to the violence of your opponent, then it should be clear to others, your opponents not least, that the analytic of hypocrisy is not working. So the point of silence or satyagraha as a visual form is that it is meant not to simply oppose the opponent, but to convert the opponent, right? And to do so directly rather than in the form of a third party by appealing to a third party, appealing to the state, appealing to the courts, appealing to other groups of people, which is what speech set against speech often does. Because speech set against speech in modern politics rarely convinces the opponent. These set forms of speech are often meant for third parties, for other people, or as debating points, whose role is never to, as it were, change people's minds. You might defeat your debating opponent in a debate, but that will not actually change their mind. So this is the problem with speech that Gandhi is so concerned with, that we might remain at a very superficial level by focusing on speech of this kind. How else might we make change possible? And he looks at silence and visuality as a way of doing it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that answer. Before we move on to the two questions that we have on the chat box, do we have one last direct question maybe from anyone?
Prajit, I think Professor Anant Giri is with us. He might have some queries directly to Faisal Devji. So Professor Giri, if you have some questions, please ask.
Professor Anand Giri, sir, if you have your queries, we'd like to invite you to the floor to.
So please unmute yourself. So we can't hear you. So you need to unmute yourself.
I'm afraid he's muted.
Professor Anand, if you kindly unmute yourself so that we can take your question.
Yes, please. So, first of all, thank you, Professor Devji. Thank you, Professor Kumar and Prajit and all friends. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Professor Devji. Now, in your deep journey with both silence and speech, the culling with Gandhi as well as with us, is not only the opposition between silence and speech, but also the reality and possibility of a different kind of speech. Because Gandhi embodied both speech and silence. And therefore, my query is that with Gandhi, there is a calling for a different kind of speech, which inhabits silence in the very journey of speech, which is also a challenge for rethinking silence, speech, and language. So it is in this context, the challenge before democracy, including language and democracy, needs to be revisited. And how do we do that? Engaging with Quentin Skinner, Wittgenstein, and Heidegger, and also Sri Aurobindo, for example, in which it is not just the opposition between speech and silence, but how do we embody both language and silence differently so that we do not become a prisoner of imposed silence. And my similar kind of query also comes to your deep reflection on inner life and externality of truth. But truth as external, is it only located in the external? The whole journey of Gandhi was also a moving non-dual. It is in that context, if external is a relation, and if we oppose the inner life and the external, are we not become a prisoner of a kind of dualism which Gandhi was fighting against? Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you very much for those excellent, really wonderfully interesting comments. With both of which I agree. Taking the second first, yes, this is why I think that for Gandhi, the externality of truth is nevertheless manifested internally within oneself. So that at the very heart of the inner life is the external force of God, as he often describes it. And when he, as I'm sure you will know, when he, from the earliest part of his career, when he writes about what he calls the inner voice in English, there are many terms he uses, including, what later becomes the sort of the given form Antaratma, the inner self. But in Gujarat, he also uses Andar no Awaj, literally the inner voice, the voice of what's inside, where voice, Antaratma doesn't necessarily have voice. It's not implied in that term, but Andar no Awaj, Awaz, is, of course, a formulation that explicitly foregrounds voice. So this voice might be inner. In fact, it can only be experienced as an inner voice, but at the same time, it does not belong to oneself. It comes from outside, and it shows you how the idea of the inner self itself is fashioned out of something that is external to itself. That at the very heart of the inner life is something, as it were, foreign to it. And it is that very foreignness, which Gandhi calls God, that nevertheless allows the inner self to relate to other selves. So rather than different selves relating to each other through language necessarily, or through reason, or through biological similarities, which are the usual ways in which we think of community and social life, it is the inner voice as itself an external form, if you will, that relates. And that inner voice called God is also, of course, called truth, and indeed primarily called truth, because Gandhi is very adamant on this, that it is not that God is truth, but truth in fact is God. So I find this really fascinating because it's, and as I tried to argue, it's not an argument about ineffability. It's not that truth is so high, so transcendental and so much above us that we cannot possibly know it. We can actually experience it because it constitutes who we are, even though it is external, and even though we cannot know it fully. The not knowing it fully is precisely what allows us to relate to our fellow human beings. Because as Gandhi says when talking about conversion in religions, the plurality of religions is important because no single one can have full purchase of the truth. And so each one is capable of learning from the others. And that learning is only possible through externality of this kind, social externality and intellectual externality. And even if that learning is possible in a competitive way, where there's a challenge, it's not simply everyone getting together and agreeing. The whole point is that people don't necessarily agree, but you refine your own vision of truth and you challenge it and you test it by reference to the tradition of others. And that allows for the evolution or the progression of truth. So, this idea of truth, which is external to everyone, it is this externality that allows us in a competitive or testing way to relate to each other. So it's entirely against, and this goes to your first question, Professor Giri, entirely against the sort of easy way in which we tend to think about the reality of human beings. So one of the reasons why I found the Gandhi on the figure of interspecies being so interesting, his arguments about that, is because he peremptorily sets aside a whole and indeed ancient way of thinking about human belonging together, which is based on voice and language and reason. And if not that, biology, and says, why don't we take the human-animal relationship as our model instead? What does that look like? We don't really share biology. We share, of course, as life forms, we share something with animals, but we don't have reproductive relations with animals, for instance, right? So we don't share a biological relationship with animals in that way, nor do we share language or reason with animals. And yet it is precisely this unavailability of language and commonality that makes for the most purely moral relationship, because in order to, it's unilateral, it does not depend upon reciprocity. It does not require the other to agree to you or to come into a contractual relationship with you in order to form, if you will, a bond. What you require is a unilateral and non-violent attitude that forces you outside yourself again. So this is another form of externality that Gandhi calls the relationship of human beings to animals a relationship that is humanitarian because it forces humanity to go outside itself, forces a species to actually move beyond itself. And it's not narcissistic in the way that he argues conventional ideas of humanity are, that they're entirely self-focused. And they can never really succeed because they end up making divisions within the category of humanity, and they are unable to give any ground to non-human life forms. So for him, weirdly, it is the human-animal relationship that holds more promise for thinking about the relations between human beings, because they disavow language and they disavow other forms of commonality, such as biology.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your question. And,
The question, please.
yes, we'll take your question. We have some questions in the chat box. We'll just take some of them for sir, and then we'll revert back to direct questions in case our time permits. I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, but there are some questions that have been lined up in the chat box.
Of course.
All right. So, sir, there are two questions which I'll club together for you to give them a more substantial gravitas for you to answer them. So the two questions are from Ms. Rinki Chaudhary and Mr. Musharraf Alam. So the first question that Ms. Rinki asks is about the extent to which silence can be justified, and what Mr. Alam asks is about the relevance of silence in the present post-truth era. So I'll club those questions together to ask you one simple question as to what is the justification that can be given to silence in the present post-truth era?
Yes, in a way, silence becomes even more important, doesn't it? Because there is the devaluation of speech and language precisely in the era of so-called fake news and post-truth, where it is no longer possible for many people to tell the difference between what is true and what is false. And indeed, the recognition that our earlier ways of distinguishing between truth and falsehood were themselves quite conventional. They were based on trust and authority. And once trust and authority are shaken, the authority of, for instance, religious leadership or political leadership or the authoritative media sources, important newspapers, national television stations, radio, etc. Once these authorities are questioned, then it becomes very difficult to make the distinction, and we see this happening all around the world. Surely it is precisely at this point that the virtues of silence become even more important. Now, of course, silence can also be misinterpreted, and this goes back to the first question. But it is perhaps better guarded than speech is. That it invites another kind of challenge. It invites another kind of criticism. And you see this in everyday political life, where people, for instance, protest against, say, curbs on free speech by literally mimicking those curbs, by putting, bands around their mouths. This is very common. People will, literally gag themselves and appear in public. They won't say anything. Their very presence, the very visibility of these faces that are unable to speak is what acts as a protest. And often that is more effective than actually speaking, though it is not meant to recommend the elimination of speech, as I said. So in a way, going back to Professor Giri's question, it's a false opposition to place speech against silence. What Gandhi is trying to do is to expand the realm of, if you will, communication or expression. He's not saying that speech is terrible and we can't rely upon it and therefore we must just have silence. He's trying to suggest that there are other modes of protest and, if you will, communication, and that silence is one and very powerful one, and that speech cannot be made to bear the entirety of this weight, and that speech cannot also therefore be made to stand in for freedom alone. That there is a necessity for thinking about other ways that protect the inner life, that protect the external life from one's own inner turmoil, and that make freedom possible, which is why I began with the image of the secret ballot, so that these two things are internal, they're coextensive. So democracy, which is based on speech, as we know, nevertheless has at its heart, when you vote, you do it alone and you do it in silence. You're not supposed to tell anyone about it. You are meant to be free to vote in whichever way you want. So at the heart of a form of a political life that is defined by speech, you have the absence of speech. And that is the paradox that I found so interesting, and that I think Gandhi really addresses. Because he too, what he does is he places silence at the heart of speech. He's not dividing the two and saying, one is an alternative to the other. He's seeing how they actually work along with each other.
Thank you so much sir, for that answer. We have some more questions in the chat box, and I'll go with that because I've sent it way before we open the floor for questioning. There's one question I'll ask in individuality, which will set the flow of the fundamentals for you to answer the next two questions. And it's interesting because Ms. Simple Mohanty asks that the insight that you gave on the internal discipline of silence in fostering a relation between the individual that protects and connects both the individual and the external world. So she says that can this idea or can this perception be the starting point or the stepping stone to reclaim the lost humanity and the moral ethos in this contemporary period or in this contemporary existence of human beings?
I don't know. I mean, I do think it's an interesting way of thinking, and Gandhi's he always does this, doesn't he? I mean, whether you agree with him or not, it's always interesting, and I find it fascinating how he comes up with these ways of thinking. You know, that are deliberately almost contrarian, that basically ask us to question our prejudices, including the most noble ones. You know, it's easy to question prejudices that are about hate and violence and all the rest. But to question prejudices that we considered really noble, like the importance of speech and freedom, you know, that is something that is that really needs more examination. And so in a way, you know, the fact that he calls his autobiography The Story of My Experiments with Truth is not accidental. You know, Gandhi's entire way of thinking is experimental in this way. He doesn't necessarily come down with a dogma for you to believe in. He says he believes in some, like nonviolence. But what he does is to submit all kinds of conventions to questioning. And surely that continues to be very important. So it is that, if you will, procedure, that way of acting or thinking by way in an experimental manner, without even making claims as to one's own truth. You know, that this is a search for truth. It is animated by truth, but it is a search that is always willing to, and indeed invites, opposition, contradiction, counter-argument, and also augmentation, support, and all the rest, right? So the point about it is that this is not one dogma against another in the way that, you know, true speech is set against false speech, let's say, which is why I think that his very silences in a way are more articulate, because they open up and ask us to think differently about the things we both like as well as dislike. And it's that focus on things we like that I think is more productive. There is some resonance here with the so famous Socratic method. You know, Socrates going around asking questions all the time and asking people to question the way they think, and in that manner move forward, as it were, more productively in their thinking. So silence is one way to do it, but it is not the only way. And I happen to think, going to this, you know, Simple Mohanty's question on humanity, I thought that you know, going back to this question of the animal, that allows us to a beginning to rethink what we mean by being human. I think it's extraordinarily fruitful, especially in our own day of ecological catastrophe. You know, how do you actually move beyond the human? Is that possible? How can you think about moral relations with non-human lives? How might those be the model for human relations rather than the reverse? Because what we normally do is we take human relations and we transpose them onto the animal world. So we often, when we protect animals in law, for instance, we make them into pseudo-human beings. We endow them, we anthropomorphize them. And that is purely narcissistic. All that is taking human forms of being and belonging and human forms of relation and expanding them to other non-human figures. It's a purely narcissistic thing, even though it is also inclusive because it ends up protecting animals. But what Gandhi suggests we do is do the opposite. How might we think of our relations with non-human beings precisely because we cannot know what they feel or think, or we can know it only very imperfectly? How might that allow us to think about our own world? So it's a questioning of the human itself that I think is so productive in Gandhi. He goes so far as to suggest that any idea of belonging together as human beings, which is premised upon biology, we eat together, we intermarry, reproduction, all of these things, and the insistence that everyone should have these relations with each other in an undifferentiated way, he thinks this is the same logic as the one that animates racism, because after all, racism is also defined by biological relations between particular groups of, within a particular group of people. And what Gandhi says is, look, if it's bad when we think about a specific group of people, that they define themselves by their intermarriages and their sharing of various things, their skin coloring or whatever it is, why should it be good when we expand the same logic to the whole of the human race? Do we really want to imagine the human race by an argument that is in fact the same argument that racists use for their more specific ideal of community? No. And it's in that context that he moves towards the figure of the animal. So, I think it's the questioning and the move outwards, as it were, that is so crucial here. And silence is simply one way of doing that.
Thank you so much, sir, for the question and the parallels that you draw between Socrates and Gandhi's silence and the link that might exist between them. Now, why I said that this question will set the base for the last two questions that we have is because here Dr. Manoj and Ms. Ashika ask about the significance and the effectiveness of silence in the contemporary world as a whole. And then Dr. Manoj follows it with that, isn't silence in this present time becoming synonymous to a subversion and submission of one's voice in quite metaphorical and literal sense? So isn't it silence in Gandhi's paradigm has changed to a definition of subversion and being vociferous for the silent? So is that the case, or do you feel that it's just a way of thinking or way of perceiving silence for one person, and it depends?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, let's think, for instance, about, it doesn't have to be about, how should I put it, physical silence or voice, but if you think about it in terms of political thought. So in our own day, for instance, we know that you have this extraordinary rise of children in politics. Greta Thunberg is only the most famous, but there's also Malala Yousafzai, and there are in India, these very young girls who are environmental activists. Now, the thing about them is that they speak, but in fact, they have no voice. They cannot vote. They're minors, right? They cannot stand for election for the moment. And, children represent, in a way, in their persons, this status. They're legal minors. Someone has to be responsible for them. They are not responsible for themselves. The power of their speech is a power that comes precisely out of this, as it were, institutionalized silence. When we think, oh, a child is doing this, one of the reasons why that surprises us is because it's not simply because they're young. It's because, in fact, they do not have an institutionalized voice in our society as children. They cannot take care of themselves. They cannot hold jobs. They are dependent upon others. So in some sense, the child, even though the child speaks all the time, the child is not heard normally in the institutions, in democratic institutions, right? the child is not independent. The child is the reverse of the political figure of freedom. And so it's not accidental that Gandhi makes children into ideal figures. He says in his 1928 commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, where he expands this idea, I think, most elaborately, but he does this in other places as well. For Gandhi, the child is a true heroic figure. Why? Because precisely because the child is not independent, right? The child depends upon others. Because the child depends upon others, and therefore is not a political figure, because to be a political agent, you have to be independent. That is the notion of freedom that informs. And only by being independent can you have a voice that is uninfluenced by others. But the child for Gandhi is a perfect moral agent precisely because in depending upon others, its parents and its teachers, it can sacrifice the future for the present. That is to say, it doesn't have to think politically, because to think politically is to think about the future and planning for the future. By focusing on the present, the child is the only human figure who, in Gandhi's view, really exists in the present. And therefore, truly a moral figure, because the child's acts in the present, insofar as they're reflective acts, are acts that are not driven by means and ends in the political sense. They're not going to sacrifice the present for the future. They are going to deal morally with things as they are given to them, and therefore they are free in his view. So it's a very interesting way of thinking, and it's precisely the child's political silence that makes this power possible, and that makes. And of course, Gandhi. This is taken from the Gita, right? Nishkam karma is you must focus on your moral duties in the present. You cannot subordinate them to the fruits of the future fruits. And it's in this way that the child embodies the perfection of the Gita's conception of the moral agent. So again, it's a playful but very nice way in which is why Gandhi's great heroic figures include people like Prahlad, Bhakt Prahlad, right? The child figure. Of course, there's the child Krishna. There are many children, who act in this manner. So, sorry, it's a long-winded way of saying that by silence, I do not mean simply biological silence. When you think about silence in political terms, in terms of political theory, then what you're looking at is also the figure of the minor. Now, today, it is children who represent this. Once upon a time, women were minors of this kind because they had no speech in political life. They were not allowed to vote, right? Non-citizens are like this, right? There are many categories of people. Slaves in times past, people who didn't own property in times past, indeed in Gandhi's own day, because there were many restrictions placed upon people. There was no universal adult suffrage in colonial India, as you know. It's only after independence that becomes possible. So Gandhi's basically is speaking for, if you will, those people who are being defined as minors in political life, who even though they have voice in some sense, cannot speak. How might we think about their agency and what can we learn from them? Sorry, that was a rather extensive response.
That's all right. So, I mean, it's better for us as much as we can hear from you. However, before we end today's question, so before we end this Q&A session today, we'll invite one last question, one last direct question to Sir.
Yeah.
Can you identify yourself, please?
Thank you. May I speak? I am Salim Akhtar.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thanks, Professor Devji, for this extremely illuminating lecture. I have one question for you. I was wondering that if we look intellectual history of 20th century India, there are ample evidences in terms of critique of positivism, its relationship with language. And my question is that, keeping in mind this intellectual history, is it possible to locate someone like Gandhi's silence genealogically in 20th century India? Because I'm reminded of Muhammad Iqbal and the kind of relationship he begins to draw between mysticism and politics. So that's something which I want to know from you, particularly from 20th century India. Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much. That's very interesting, especially because, like Gandhi, in some ways, Iqbal is also a critic of conventional ways of thinking about our politics and our freedom and our society. And, even though they disagreed on a number of issues, Iqbal and Gandhi actually come quite close together on a number of others. They're both interested in sacrifice and in the sacrificial form that moral agency takes. They're both interested, obviously, in religion. But as far as language and voice are concerned, I mean, I guess what I would say is that both of them also understand, as colonized figures, that however they might argue, very often that the voices of colonized people cannot be heard institutionally. And of course, this is one reason why there was so great that the turn to violence happened so frequently. And Gandhi discusses it in Hind Swaraj. How do you, because Hind Swaraj, as you know, is a dialogue between a revolutionary nationalist who wants to deploy violence in order to achieve India's freedom, and a figure who more or less represents Gandhi himself, who says no, only non-violence can achieve that freedom for many, many reasons, including the fact that if you use violence to achieve freedom, you will perpetuate violence in the politics of the new Indian nation. And in doing so, you will do nothing more than repeat what the colonizer has done. And so you will never actually get out of that, out of the very tyranny that you want liberty from. You will actually perpetuate it yourself. You will just replace white faces with brown faces. So both these men are concerned with what can be heard and what cannot be heard, what can be said and what cannot be said, not simply in terms of law, what you're going to be slapped with a kind of sedition charge for, but rather what literally is conceivable, almost epistemologically. And as you know, in the 20th century and to some degree the 19th century as well, there were all kinds of protests, arguments, demonstrations that could not be understood for various reasons. The mutiny, the Indian mutiny, has to be understood only as traditional superstition. People refusing to bite those bullet cartridges because they are supposedly greased with cow or pig fat, right? It has to be dismissed as superstition. Figures even like someone mentioned Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo, who can also only be understood as being these kinds of strange, either he's meant to be a terrorist or he's meant to be a kind of entirely spiritual figure. In neither case is the voice to be taken seriously in terms of political thought. So both these men were concerned with these kinds of issues, but rather than simply fight for, which they also nevertheless did, the expansion of, if you will, political culture and thought to permit voices to be heard in this sense, they were also fully cognizant of the limitations of voice in modern politics. That exclusion made them think about the inherent limitations of modern politics. And just like Gandhi telling his interlocutor in his Swaraj that we don't want to just replace white faces with brown ones, so too both Gandhi and Iqbal didn't simply want inclusion into this pre-existing structure. They wanted to change the structure. And the question is, how do you do that? The structure of political voice or political opinion. Now, there's a way of doing that which is institutional, where you criticize, Westminster-type parliaments, as I described Simone Weil doing. She even wants to get rid of the political party. Gandhi doesn't want to do that, and neither does Iqbal. They have perhaps a more subtle way of thinking about changing the structure. And it has to do with forms of creating venues of communication, argumentation, debate that are not entirely subordinated to the conventional structures that define political voice or political speech. And one reason why Iqbal writes poetry is because of this. Apart from the fact that he's a good poet, what does it mean to express your philosophical and political thoughts in poetic form? And that too, not just in Urdu, but in Persian, which is a language that by his time is really not known by most people, even by most highly educated people in India. It calls for, it's a challenge. It offers itself as a challenge. It calls for learning. It calls for interpretation. And the process of learning and interpretation immediately removes you from the conventional carapace of political voicing and political thinking. And I think that's one of the things that Iqbal's poetry forces you to do. Like Gandhi, in a different way, he's very interested in what remains unsaid, what cannot be said, what cannot be known, not simply as something ineffable, it's God, that you cannot really know God. But there's always something incomplete there. So just as Gandhi says that he cannot even know what Kastuba really thinks, because truth can never be fully known, Iqbal's poetry is based on the idea of incompletion. Right? These stars that are forever moving, there's a world after this, not after this world in a religious sense, but it's an infinite space which you cannot really traverse. And Iqbal his entire political and philosophical and poetic oeuvre is about the beauty of incompletion, that you are forever in movement. The stars are forever in movement. The traveler never reaches the shore, right? The boat is always on the wave, on the river. And this incompletion is, for Iqbal, is where beauty comes from. It is where freedom comes from. If the truth were given to you already, there would be no freedom and there would be no beauty. So he doesn't want a pre-given truth. He's very much like Gandhi in this way. You must always move towards it. You can never really get it, but the journey is not a failure. The journey is not the journey is the point. The journey is the freedom, and the journey is the beauty. And that's his idea of aesthetics as well. So with those disjointed ways of thinking about Iqbal and Gandhi, which I had not previously done, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, sir, for that answer. I mean, this is the first time any one of us, I guess, would have been listening to a parallel between Iqbal Saab and Gandhiji. But however, thank you, Talim Akhtar, for that question, and thank you, sir, for your answer. Yes, we can take one last direct question. We have many professors and scholars joining us today for this session today. We have Professor Ishi along with us, Professor Kazuya Ishi. If ma'am, you would like to ask any kind of question or any kind of comment on sir, or ask for any kind of clarification, we'd invite you to please pose that, or anyone wishing to ask a direct question to sir, you're most welcome to do that. Or else, if there is none, we'll end this wonderful and fruitful question answer session that we have had with Faisal sir.
Yeah, Biprajit, I think we have had an interesting and fascinating session. So if there are no questions now, so we should proceed with Zoya taking up the proceedings further. And we thank you all. Zoya, please continue.
Thank you, sir. I now invite Dr. Ratnam Vattal ma'am, convener of Internal Quality Assurance Cell, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Zoya, for giving me this opportunity to propose vote of thanks. I want to start by congratulating the Gandhi Study Circle for organizing the distinguished Gandhi Lecture Series. On behalf of the organizing committee and the IQAC, and also in my own capacity, I thank our esteemed speaker, Professor Devji, for accepting our invitation to deliver a talk on this very interesting topic, Gandhi's science. Mahatma Gandhi's life and philosophy continues to intrigue us and remains a source of learning and inspiration till today. Professor Devji's lecture has left us with a deeper insight into the events associated with Gandhi's life, and today we all go back with a fresh perspective on the past. How well said that silence is internal discipline which protects outer environment. I thank you, sir, for sharing your time and knowledge with all of us. Thank you once again. I'm also indebted to our principal, Professor Bey, for his constant support and motivation in organizing such lectures of intellectual excellence. We are indeed grateful to you, sir, for having given the opening remarks in the webinar. We are grateful to the participants who have joined us from across the country to attend this lecture. I thank the members of Gandhi Study Circle and IQAC for their munificent help in organizing the webinar. Thank you all for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure.
Thank you, Professor Faisal Devji. We look forward to have you in the next proceedings of ours. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Not at all. Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to seeing you personally at some point when that becomes possible.
Definitely. I would like you also to respond to my current work, which has just been published by Routledge. So I will send you a copy of that.
Please.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.